As we speak right now, President Trump is meeting in the White House with current President Joe Biden, where they're meeting together to talk about the transition of power and all the transitions that have to go at the various cabinet levels and all of that. It's a historic event, of course, and no small disappointment, I'm sure, for President Biden. But this is really the bigger issue that we wanted to talk about today. Of course, naturally, is a lot of the senior officials that Trump has picked to roll his cabinet. And by the way, just to set you up, apparently President Trump is going to make some comments when he comes out of the White House. If he does, we'll break to that, get those comments live, and then come back and talk about them on the backside. But to help make some sense out of all these things and kind of take a look at a lot of controversy, even among the MAGA world, about some of these picks that Trump has announced so far, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor, who once at the end of Trump's first term actually worked in the administration, a special advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So he has some definite insight into how these things work and what matters. And so we're going to look at that. But Doug, first of all, just welcome back to the show. We're always grateful to have you here.
Oh, thanks.
And look, even before we get that, though, because there's some news that's breaking this morning that's haven't penetrated much of the Western media so far, because really all the stuff about Trump and everything else. But Turkey has broken diplomatic relations with Israel. Now, especially coming on the heels of Biden's loss and heading into the Trump administration, this seems kind of ill-timed. I'm sure Trump didn't want to have to deal with this, but can you please explain to people why this happened? Because it's going to come out of left field for most people, and why you're concerned about it.
No, this is a very important development. Let there be no question about it. Keep in mind that certainly since this tragic war in Gaza broke out and the expulsion and killing of hundreds, tens of thousands, over 100,000 now, I think the Lancet Journal said over 189,000 Arabs, Muslim and some Christian, driven out of their homes permanently, driven into camps, and so forth. Turkey has exercised tremendous restraint, largely because Mr. Erdogan, like everybody else in the region, doesn't want to be involved in a war. He wants to build up his country, build its prosperity. But things have gone from bad to worse. Lebanon has changed the equation for Mr. Erdogan, because 1.5 to 2 million people, refugees from Lebanon, are now moving towards Turkey. And they've already got 4 or 5 million refugees living inside their country. They can't afford any more. So he's being pushed and pushed and pushed. In addition to which, keep in mind that Turkey historically, because of its Ottoman past, has been considered the leading state of Sunni Islam. And many of the Arabs, most of the Arabs, of course, are Sunni Muslims, have been disappointed in the absence of Turkey as a voice for reason, and also a willingness to combat what's happening in Israel. And I think what's happened now is the assumption that we and the Israelis made was that everyone would sit quietly, do nothing, while tens of thousands of Muslim Arabs, first in Gaza, secondly in southern Lebanon, and increasingly in the so-called West Bank, would be killed and made homeless, and nobody would do anything about it. The other point is that Mr. Erdogan has been supplying Israel first with a lot of goods and food. That has largely stopped. But now the question is, what will he do about the oil? Because the Israelis have been extraordinarily dependent upon the oil shipped to them from Azerbaijan through Turkey down into Syria and Israel. If they don't have access to that oil, that represents about 80% of the oil that is utilized by the Israelis, they're in a very serious problem. And so we'll wait and see what he does about that. But the point is that he's now jumped on board with virtually everyone else in the region. Everyone in the region is now aligned with Iran against Israel, something that everybody thought was impossible. There you go. That's it. And that line is extraordinarily important to the Israelis. And of course, everybody has allowed black market operations to go on: Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, moving things in and out of Israel, but the oil is by far the single most important commodity. If that's cut off, then Israel's in a lot of trouble.
And I want to go a little bit further, because you're talking about a region wide here. Turkey alone is a big issue for all the reasons you just mentioned. But it's not just Turkey. You also have what was enmity between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Actually, China helped bring them together not long ago. But now then, even in the last few days, they're also getting closer and closer together diplomatically. How do you see that?
This is extraordinarily important, because not only was there historically animosity or hostility between the two, but I think the two have concluded that their interests obviously coincide, particularly when it comes to the movement of oil and goods and natural gas and so forth. And also with Russia and China. 90% of all the oil that's produced by Iran goes to China. So the notion that if you cut the oil off, that somehow or another you're going to harm Iran is crazy. In other words, that we cut it off as far as their ability to export to us in the West. Their principal export is to China. If you cut that oil off, then obviously the Chinese are very unhappy, and the Chinese already have a small flotilla of ships outside the Persian Gulf, and I suspect they'll send submarines out there, and they will eventually cooperate or coordinate with the Russian vessels that are in the area, as well as Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, here's the worst case scenario, though, and that is that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates decide to pull their wealth from our banks and repatriate it entirely to the peninsula. That's being discussed, and that would have a very, let us say, deleterious impact on the United States. And in addition to pulling their wealth out and repatriating it to the peninsula, I would expect them to dump their remaining treasuries. They've always controlled, almost 40% of our treasuries. These things are the treasury bonds that were issued at very, very low interest rates that now increasingly have no value, at least on the open markets. If they dump those and sell them off at bargain prices, our markets are in a lot of trouble. So it's not just a question of kinetic warfare. There are many other things that are happening on the sidelines that could have a hugely negative impact on us.
Well, and plus we've had, I believe, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have both petitioned to sign BRICS, so to join into that as well, on top of Iran. So you talked about Russia and China, and you see that whole thing expanding right before our eyes. To what extent do you think these announcements and these activities are happening after Trump was elected, but before he takes power? Is this some kind of a signal to the administration that they want to see some sort of change in policy?
Yeah, I think so. But the problem is that they were waiting for President Trump to announce his candidates for office. In other words, his nominees for appointed positions. And having watched the names come out, and they know the backgrounds, none of these people are stupid. They actually pay attention to our media. They pay attention to the figures in the media that are reporting on what's happening here. They look at the figures that are nominees, and they have concluded, not unreasonably, that all of these nominees are Israeli approved, that effectively these people are 100% with Israel's war in the region. It's not just a question of do they like Israel or do they favor Israel, or would they support Israel if Israel needed support in the process of simply defending itself. That's not what this is about. They see that these people have effectively sworn allegiance to the Zionist cause. That's the way it is viewed in the Middle East. I think it's viewed that way around the world. So if that's the case, and these are the people that are going to be in positions of enormous influence and power, and they assume that given the fact that the Senate and the House are both largely in the grip of AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, or Political Affairs Committee, that then they see this as a 100% backing for Israel in its war, and they have to assume that we will join it. So all of these things are now coming out at a point in time where everyone in the region has said the game is up. There's no hope for something better. There will be no discussions. There will be no negotiating. We're stuck with a very dangerous situation. The question is, what are they going to do about it? And I think what they're doing right now is carefully coalescing into an effective alliance. And I think you'll see some very interesting things over the next few weeks. Now, none of us knows what comes next. Iran is held back because Iran was kind of hopeful that, Mr. Trump would turn out to be someone with whom they could talk and negotiate. That doesn't seem to be the case. And others had probably favored the same thing. The real question is, what does Mr. Netanyahu do? Mr. Netanyahu has everything he wants. This is his dream outcome. Will Mr. Netanyahu simply wait quietly until Iran finally counters the last Israeli strike? Or will he say, no, we're not going to wait? And historically, Israel hasn't. When it felt that it was threatened in any way, shape, or form, it is struck at its enemies. Well, in this case, they're already at war for all intents and purposes with everybody in the region. Why would they wait? So will Mr. Netanyahu, in fact, strike Iran? I don't know, but I think the situation is very explosive, and something's bound to happen between now and the 21st of January, right?
Certainly the conditions seem to favor that, and it's a lot of very tough tinder that could just be ignited with a very small spark of it, and especially if it's a bigger one. But I want to get into what you just said there, specifically about the the cabinet that Trump has selected, because there's a lot in MAGA world that are raising some alarms over some of these choices. And of course, nobody's been confirmed yet. This has just been an announcement, but just based on the choices, there's some concern about the direction they're going. And I want to look at some of that. We're going to start off with Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth from Fox News, who was interviewed just a few days ago, actually a few days before all this came in, with some very illuminating things. And I want to look at some of those comments that he made there. Some are hopeful, some are positive, and some less so. We'll take a look at it. First of all, he was asked, are you worried about nuclear war?
Are you concerned about nuclear war?
I mean, yes, in a general sense, I guess. I found overinflated from the beginning this idea that Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine was going to lead to nuclear war or war across the continent. I've always felt like it was, from the beginning, like a couple days in, I was like, this feels like a Putin's give me my shit back war. It kind of feels like, I feel like you've been pushing pretty hard, and we used to have the former Soviet Union, and we were pretty proud of that. And Ukraine was a part of it, and all these other countries, and I want my shit back. And I think I'm at the right time where I'm powerful enough to do it. And you're not quite on my border yet. And Biden's AWOL, so I'm going for it. And just like I did under my minor incursion under Obama, I got what I could. I got Crimea. Now I waited under Trump. Now I'm going to get my... And this idea that I hear all the time, and I've friends who would probably agree with us on most things. They're like, well, if you don't stop him in Ukraine, then he's going to go all the way to Poland. And he's going... I don't think he's... I mean, maybe in a perfect world where he had unlimited capabilities and he could crown himself king of Europe, he would. I think he's probably knows enough to know that it's probably not going much further than Ukraine.
Now, a couple of things really jumped out at there. Me, the first one was alarming, where he said, "Yeah, I'm kind of worried about nuclear war." How does that make you? How does that strike you that the Secretary of Defense nominee is only sort of worried about nuclear war?
Well, admittedly, the entire discussion was not terribly nuanced or informed, and certainly not by any means sophisticated. So the only thing I can say is that his views are sadly not very different from most congressmen on the Hill and from a lot of senators. None of these people have very sophisticated views of events overseas, and particularly of Russia or Iran or Turkey or China or any of these places. Most of them never been there, and if they were there, they were tourists, flew in, flew out. So I'm not really surprised, Dan. And remember, as we've talked so often, Americans have lost their very reasonable fear of war. You know, as we've talked before, when I was growing up, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember what people did, how people felt, and their concerns. And obviously, President Kennedy was extremely concerned and alarmed by the statements of people made that like Curtis LeMay and the chief of naval operations at the time, because he absolutely was horrified at the prospect of any kind of nuclear exchange, knowing full well the poisonous impact of such a thing. So, you know, he represents, I think, Pete Hegseth, who is a very nice guy and gives a good rousing speech in support of Trump when he was on the campaign trail, is just expressing views in a way that I think is not very different from a lot of Americans.
And let's look at the second part of that there, where he was talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, in that at least he doesn't seem to be going any, like the Biden administration, we're going to be there forever, we're going to help them, and otherwise they're coming for us. And so do you get any optimism from his view there?
Well, I think he reflects the attitude that's developing, that we've wasted enough money on this enterprise. He says, well, I don't think he'll go much beyond Ukraine. That's fine. And he's not going to go much beyond the Dnieper River unless, we compel it. So that's fine. But this, again, is blowing with the wind in Washington. The wind has changed in Washington. The money is drying up. No one wants to stand up and say what a catastrophic error this was and admit the folly. So everybody sort of says, well, that's enough. We've done all we can. And they walk away. We did that after Vietnam. Very little accountability is involved. It doesn't give me much hope for any sort of rational approach in the future, Dan. I mean, come on, let's face it. It's easy to say now, well, I guess that's not going to work. But thanks very much. I mean, look at the legions of people who are saying, well, I guess Ukraine can't win. And just 6 weeks ago, they were hard over. And he wasn't any different. Let's give more strike weapons to the Ukrainians so they can do more damage to the Russians. That was something from Waltz when he was in Congress just a few weeks ago. Now he's changed his tune. It doesn't give me any confidence that we have anybody thinking entering these offices at the moment.
And it's also important to understand the environment that he's going to come into. So we had General Bauer, the NATO general, I think in charge of ground forces. I can't remember his exact title, but he is, I think, trying to set the stage that they're not going to, quote, give in on the change of American leadership here. Were a couple of things he exposed here, which I don't think he intended to. First of all, his comment there, he said, actually, Afghanistan was never of strategic importance. If we're really honest, we spent 20 years there and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wait a minute. You're just acknowledging that the whole thing was pointless in there and that it contained nothing of any strategic value for the United States. Then, of course, the question is, then why the hell do we stay for 20 years when you knew it wasn't? That's one. The second part, though, is more important, because he says, no, we have to keep going for Ukraine because it is, quote, connected to the rules-based international order, and that's important to us. And this just shows that, you can say, like you just did, that at least Hegseth and many people are saying, well, all right, this didn't work, let's start closing it down. But that doesn't seem to be the case in NATO. They're still with this fiction that it matters if you want this rules-based order. Like, you can just choose to, no, we'll keep going here until we win. But that's just divorced from reality as it can get. What do you make of that?
Well, the rules-based order is ultimately whatever we say it is, because we make the rules. We're talking about the United States of America. The notion that we have any respect for international law is absurd. We've ignored international law, customs, and rules whenever it suits us to do so. So that's a lot of nonsense. Second thing, if China has any ambitions in Ukraine, it's to build rail lines into Ukraine so that China can import the wheat and other food products, commodities that Ukraine produces, back to China. And China can sell its goods to the Ukrainians. That's about it. See, the thing is that he, like so many people in the United States, are living in a world that no longer exists. Strangely enough, President Putin and President Xi are interested in a world where there is no war, because war is ultimately bad for business, which they understand. They want to get this over with. They want to stop it. They want to get back to building prosperity and improving the living standards in their countries. They have huge numbers of people that want to live better, who aspire to live better. They want to meet those needs and expectations. We, on the other hand, think that these are all bloodthirsty criminals leading vast armies ready to sweep down on all of us. That's a lot of nonsense. They don't. They're not interested in it. We're the ones who still view the use of bullying tactics with our military, sanctions and tariffs as the way forward. And we can't rely on that anymore. We don't live in a world where that favors us in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it's not 1991 anymore, which we never left that mentality. You mentioned China and some of the things they want. In that same interview there, Hegseth was talking about how he views China and how some of the Pentagon's own war computer simulations have not turned out well. Now, he's going to say something here on the one hand that seems pretty self-evident. I think you and I have talked about this before, but then it's where he goes after that that raises a little eyebrows.
In the past X number of years, 10, 12, 15, the Pentagon has a perfect record in all of its war games against China. We lose every time inside the Pentagon war games. We know what our real capability. You see, we didn't even get to this part of the war on warriors. I mean, the military-industrial complex, the way we procure weapon systems. We're always, the way our system works, the way our bureaucratic system works, where the speed of weapons procurement works, we're always a decade behind in fighting the last war. Whereas China, we have, what did Rumsfeld say? You go to the war, the army you have. We have the army. China's building an army specifically dedicated to defeating the United States of America. That is their strategic outset. Take hypersonic missiles. So if our whole power projection platform is aircraft carriers and the ability to project power that way strategically around the globe. And yeah, we have a nuclear triad and all of that, but a big part of it. And if 15 hypersonic missiles can take out our 10 aircraft carriers in the first 20 minutes of a conflict, what does that look like?
Now, you have been talking about the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier and how it's like the battleship of the age old that we haven't recognized yet. So you probably would agree with that part there. And certainly, I've talked about the imbalance in that part of the world. If we went over to fight China on their terms, in their front door over the issue of Taiwan, they have all the operational advantages. But if he's right on that, then that would portend a significant change of policy, especially if he's going to lead the Pentagon to where we have to have very different policies regarding China, and they can't continue to be hostile and pushing. How do you view that?
In January 1997, when Breaking the Phalanx was published, I had a whole chapter on a war in CENTCOM, and I compared the Navy's position to that of our ships off the coast of Okinawa during World War II. In fact, my father was serving on one of those vessels and sat under the hail of kamikazes that flew in. The kamikazes sunk something like 9 ships, damaged another 26 or 27. It was a very frightening experience. And my point was, what you saw with the kamikazes, make it, you sort of cube it and then make it much more lethal. And large numbers of shore batteries consisting of cruise missiles and unmanned, what a cruise missile is essentially an unmanned attack system. They'll sink most of these amphibious ships and other kinds of vessels and changing warfare. Well, that was in 97. Of course, I was pilloried and the Navy renounced me because I was arguing for no more aircraft carriers. Don't build anymore. Let's use these until retirement because they're only useful as in a permissive environment. That's true, but he's saying that now, and of course, more and more people have come on board with this idea. I think Andy Krepanevich had the idea of an arsenal ship, which wasn't all that bad. It looked something like the Monitor from the Civil War, and just carried lots and lots of missiles that it could launch. But the truth of the matter is, submarines rule the waves, and our preeminent priority strategically should be the building of additional submarines and the maintenance of that fleet. Certainly the maintenance of the human capital. That goes into another discussion.
Yeah. That's
important. I don't think he knows anything. I think he's mouthing things. That goes on in Washington a lot. Most people in Washington have a cocktail level of familiarity with anything. And you go to the cocktail party and you pick up on what's the theme. And so targeting aircraft carriers, that's an easy theme right now. People point to that sort of thing. The thing he doesn't understand is that guess who's building aircraft carriers? The Chinese.
Yeah.
Now, why are they building aircraft carriers? Are they building it because they want to attack us? No, because that's seen as a metric of your greatness as a great power, just as battleships in the 1930s were viewed in the same way. Adolf Hitler wasted precious time and resources on battleships, the Bismarck, the Gneisenau, and they were great ships, but they were no longer necessary.
Yeah.
Had he plowed all of that into submarines, he could have begun the war with more submarines. He had something like 29 operational submarines when the war broke out. And people have run those war games and said that if Adolf Hitler had had 50 plus submarines at the beginning of the war, he'd have won. He'd have sunk everything.
Wow.
That's the war game that he should be interested in paying attention to. That's the lesson of the Second World War. And Nimitz said as much at the end of the war. He said, none of us appreciated the lethality and importance of the submarine. And Nimitz had commanded a submarine. So that's nice, Pete. Great. That's not part of a larger strategy. There is no new strategy. If there's no new strategy, you can't get a new structure. If you don't have a new structure, you're not going to get new people. You're just putting one or two people here or there that you think are going to lead somewhere new. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to go down the list of, because what's at least supposed to be what's written out is the job description of the Secretary of Defense is supposed to be to set a national security strategy and then to make sure that the force actually supports that strategy and you can actually get it done within the resource constraints that you have, et cetera. And he mentioned in that clip there something that Rumsfeld had said in 2005. He said, well, you get the army that you have when you go to war. Now, you have been publishing all these books since 1997 forward that literally lay out a blueprint for how to go there and how to get a force that can actually meet the next war, not trying to look at what happened in the previous war. What can he do to try and build a force for the future while avoiding war in China?
Well, I'm glad that somebody's finally wakened up and started talking about the folly of war with China, because my point on China from the very beginning has been that there's an old saying in the Navy, a ship's a fool to fight a fort. In other words, if you think your ships offshore are going to demolish a well-fortified site that's ashore with all the equipment and capabilities and weapon systems to fight back, you're wrong. You're going to lose. China is the largest fortress in the history of mankind. And all of their investments in shore batteries and missiles makes it very, very dangerous for us to approach China. And that's the whole point. We talk about this denial strategy that the Chinese have invented, or they haven't really invented it, but adopted. And we keep talking about how we're going to break through this denial strategy and win the war. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. You can't do it. They've got more missiles than we have ships. They have more capabilities to hurl at us than we have ships. But the truth is that with 7 or 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, you could shut down all the commerce that goes in and out of China from the sea. Think about that. So the notion of building more surface ships at this stage for that kind of purpose makes no sense. But that threat is understood by the Chinese. They're working very hard to try and make some breakthroughs in anti-submarine technology. Now, having said all of that, let's get back to strategy. There's no point in attacking China. It doesn't make any sense. Asia is not interested in war. Nobody in Asia wants to go to war. This is the great myth that is perpetrated in Washington to justify out-of-control defense spending. This is where you get people like Elbridge Colby, who for years has been talking about the war with China. He thought he could become Secretary of the Navy and then ultimately preside over some wasteful buildup of the surface fleet to reenact whatever happened in the 1960s or 70s, to realize Admiral Zumwalt's dream of a carrier-based fleet attacking the Russians on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Well, that was fine for Admiral Zumwalt, and he was a brilliant man, but that makes no sense now. So you need a different strategy, and we have to get past assuming certain states are enemies and others are friends. We live in an environment where everyone is a limited liability partner. That means that we share interests with most people most of the time. We want access to the global commons, space, the atmosphere, the oceans, and so forth. That's what's important. And we ought to be interested in that. And we should be interested in avoiding unnecessary conflict because it's destructive. We've lost, what, 14 trillion since 2001 on these crazy wars in the Middle East. And you and I sat in the desert in 1991 when victory was declared, long before anything of real importance had happened. And what was really important? It was the decapitation or removal of the people in Baghdad. Okay, you put in another bunch. You offer control to a new group of generals, invite the UN to come in and hold elections, and you get the hell out. That was something that should have happened in 2003, but we were fighting for different reasons. We were trying to make the entire Middle East, along with much of the world, safe for Israel. It hasn't worked very well. It's made matters much worse for Israel. And that's been obvious to me and to many Israelis since 2003. That's mixing apples and oranges. Well, Afghanistan was irrelevant, but Ukraine is really important. Why? We have no long-term strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. Nobody in Europe does. Everybody in Europe wants to do business with Ukraine and Russia and White Russia. Why? Because of the things they have. That's what the great marriage of Germany to Russia was always all about, a mutually beneficial arrangement, much like the one that exists today between Russia and China. We need to get out of this. We don't fit into it, and it's not in our interest, but we need a new strategy along the lines that I've discussed.
Yeah, indeed we do. And in fact, because you mentioned that about the Middle East also, and how we've been trying to reorganize that or reorder it, and it's just been backfired. Here is what Hegseth said regarding the Middle East. And interestingly enough, because he starts off by saying that he's a reformed neocon.
I've been a recovering neocon for 6 years now. Like the foolishness with which we ricocheted around the world, intervening, think it was in our best interest, when really we just overturned the table and created something worse in almost every single scenario, has led to almost, I mean, the hubris of the Pentagon is that they want to now tell other countries how to do counterinsurgency based on what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, are you kidding me? So you really have learned nothing. Okay, nothing. So yeah, you're right. The trust there that our political leaders or our generals would have our best interests in mind is totally broken. It's totally broken. I acknowledge that completely. And the last thing I want is my son deploying to the Donbass to defend Eastern Ukraine.
Now, before I get your comment on that, he says he's a recovering neocon from 6 years ago, but here's something that he said regarding the Middle East from 4 years ago.
Sometimes you have moments, Steve, and I happen to believe that we can't kick the can down the road any longer in trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. They used the killing of Soleimani as an excuse to say, we're scrapping the Iran deal. We all know they were scrapping it anyway. So what better time than now to say, we're starting the clock. You've got a week. You've got X amount of time before we start taking out your energy production facilities. We take out key infrastructure. We take out your missile sites. We take out nuclear developments. We take out popular capabilities. Or, you know what, take out a Quds headquarters while you're at it if you want. I understand that's not a popular idea.
But I understand, I've been hearing that we believe that the Iranians are hiding missiles and weapons in some of these cultural sites, churches,
of course they do.
Mosques.
This is what Islamists do. Is what they've done on the battlefield against folks like me and my entire generation. Human shields, using mosques, using hospitals, schools. This is what our enemies do. Now that doesn't mean we go on and target cultural sites, but what it means is we are clear-eyed about how our enemies use the rules that we write against us. And if we want to defeat them, this is something, having seen it, if we want to defeat them, we have to think smart about how these rules, how we navigate within these rules without playing in a game that's rigged to help them so that we can't win. If we're going to fight to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, this regime, then we need to rewrite the rules that are advantageous to us. I don't want to hit cultural sites on purpose, but if you're using one to harbor your most dangerous weapons, then that should be on the target list.
And the president did.
Well, that's we can hope that 4 years ago that was his view, and maybe it's not now. But especially given Trump's proclivity to generally avoid war, how do you see him coming into this one now?
Well, you just listen to the Israeli mantra. That is exactly the argument that they make. And then they go on to insist that their war is our war, that our interests and theirs are identical. It's a dangerous path because most of his comments are taken, if you take them out of context, they don't make much sense. And the context is something that everybody ignores that wants to go to war with Iran. And that's what this is all about. And if you want to benefit from what I would call Israeli largesse, which is really Jewish capital in the diaspora, then you have to sign on for the war with Iran. And that's what he's done. That's what he's about. It's unfortunate because it's very simplistic. You know, I remember people that were cheering that we had killed Soleimani in Iraq. And I pointed out that there were a couple of problems with this. First of all, Soleimani technically was a member of a foreign government. He was the equivalent of the national security advisor to the supreme leader. So he's essentially the same as if someone killed Waltz and then cheered in the streets. Look what we've done. Dumb idea. It was wrong. It was against international law. It was actually against our own laws. Secondly, well, he's responsible for all these American deaths in Iraq. No, he's not. What he did is what we would do if we had an enemy in Mexico. What would we do if there were Russian or Chinese forces in Mexico backing one side against another side in Mexico, and the other side being perhaps a more moderate or liberally minded group versus a group that wanted to not only capture control of Mexico, but then wage war on us? I think we'd have been much tougher on our enemy in Mexico than the Iranians ever were on us in Iraq. You know, you can't isolate these things. He's talking about warfare that is precise and clean and sterile. That doesn't exist. You can't bomb things with impunity. We can't bomb our way out of anything, neither can Netanyahu. This is a dead end. And if we keep it up, we're going to end up at war with a pretty substantial portion, not just of the Middle East, but probably of Asia and Russia. And this is unnecessary. It's counterproductive. It's antithetical to our interests. We're not ready for it. We're not prepared for it.
Now, I can hope that because that comment was made 4 years ago, perhaps he's changed his mind in them, but it's a little tougher when we look at Trump's CIA director, John Ratcliffe, who I think just yesterday said this.
When they engage in an active war of trying to assassinate President Trump, and perhaps most importantly, when they engage in the active war of firing through its Houthi-controlled rebels ballistic missiles at 3 U.S. warships, and there had been no actions and no consequences to those acts of war by Iran, it unfortunately tells you how far the Democrats are willing to go to stop Donald Trump. And, you know, I think larger at play here, Maria, is not just this short-term election, but that it really reveals the failed strategy of the Democrats over the last 10 years in dealing with Iran. You know, the famous Obama doctrine, which was that, look, we can deter Iran diplomatically and it won't come at the expense of Israel. Well, Barack Obama was wrong. He misunderstood the lethality and the evil nature of the Iranian regime. And what Israel has done is essentially employ the Trump doctrine, a maximum pressure campaign, understanding that the only way to deter terrorists like Iran and their proxies is to put your foot on their throat. And Israel has done that. We should be assisting Israel in doing so.
Yeah, why should we be assisting Israel in doing so when the United States itself, number one, that violates our Constitution, because unless we're attacked, our armed forces are not to be used on behalf of someone else to go after their enemies. So aside from that issue there, talk about the real regional problems that doing what he said would cause the U.S.
He and the rest of the people that are being nominated for key cabinet positions are all evidence for what more and more people are calling elite capture. There's nothing more reliable than a man who can be bought for cold, hard cash. All of these people are bought and paid for. There have been investments for 20 years, ranging into hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars by Israel and its agents in the United States to drive us to war against Iran. Now they're positioned to finally get what they want. All of these people are signing on for it. Secondly, this business about the Iranians set out to assassinate President Trump, I've never bought into that. This comes from the same people who told us there were nuclear weapons in Iraq when there were none. The intelligence agencies have either misrepresented or simply outright lied about so much over many decades that it's very difficult to take what they say seriously. What we ought to be worried about are the implications of our own actions and where our actions could lead us into destructive wars that we don't want to fight, that we don't need to fight, that the American people don't want. We need to tend to our needs here at home. And that appears to be the last thing on the agenda of this new administration.
And that's so that was with the CIA director. Next, I want to turn to the at least the presumed Secretary of State pick. Now, it's been in the news for at least 48 hours that it's going to be Marco Rubio, though it still has not been, curiously enough, publicly, officially announced by the administration or the incoming administration. We'll see how that turns out. But here is Tulsi Gabbard talking about Marco Rubio when he was being considered as a vice presidential candidate earlier this summer.
I think it would be a huge mistake for President Trump to choose him because he represents the neocon warmongering establishment of Washington, D.C., which stands diametrically opposed to the very policies that President Trump has always stood for, going all the way back to when he ran for president in 2016 through that first term in office, and the things that he's talking about wanting to do now. And it would send the wrong message to a lot of folks who are very concerned about the fact that we are on the brink of war with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. If Marco Rubio is his vice president, then that is what we will face, and it will cause a lot of people to question what kind of foreign policy will actually be executed. Will it be the one that Trump wants and stands for, or will it be one that will continue the deep state neocon warmongers who've gotten us into the mess that we are in now?
Hard to argue with that same prohibition against him being the vice presidential candidate to be the Secretary of State, because it does seem to be opposed to what Trump says he stands for. How do you see it?
Well, obviously, I think Tulsi Gabbard would make a much better Secretary of State because she represents the more balanced and nuanced approach to foreign policy and recognizes the criticality of avoiding war. I think Tulsi Gabbard and others that support Donald Trump, like me, have to come to the conclusion that what Trump thinks is either unclear or it's clear. And he has hitched his wagon 100% to the Zionist cause in the Middle East, which means war to expand the state of Israel and destroy everyone that Israel doesn't like or Israel fears. That includes, first and foremost, Iran. I think he and his team are committed to that objective. That's where we're headed. If anybody has any questions about it, start paying attention to what people actually say. At some point, you have to listen to people and believe them. And President Trump has made very clear statements about Iran and where he expects to go. And if anything, he's being critical for the most part of the Biden administration for not doing enough against Iran. And I think Waltz and Hegseth are of the same mindset. So is Rubio. I think anybody who shows up in the State Department is going to have to toe that line, which is why I don't think Tulsi will show up there. But if she did, she would be swimming in unfriendly waters. She'd probably have Brian Hook as her deputy and be surrounded by dozens of people in the State Department who are plugging the same line. This is the problem. They say, well, nominate so-and-so, he can go in there and make a difference. It's not easy. It doesn't work that way. If you show up with the kinds of views that Tulsi Gabbard has, you're going to be the Lone Ranger in the biggest rainstorm you've ever seen. And what we're headed towards right now is really the storm of the century. Now, you can quibble about qualifications. Who's qualified, who isn't? You know, for instance, somebody called me, a journalist, and said, what do you think about Pompeo? I said, well, listen, I don't share his views. He and I have virtually nothing in common in terms of our views of the world, but Pompeo is qualified to be Secretary of Defense. There's no question about that. Would I support it? No, and I would argue against it. I'm glad he's not on his way into that job. Then you have to turn your attention to the others that are being appointed various positions like Waltz and now Hegseth, and you have to ask, where's the evidence for the kinds of things that you would look for in those positions? And I don't see much evidence for them. I mean, I don't want to be that harsh. A friend of mine who's a retired 4-star, and yes, I do have some 4-star friends that are retired, sent me a note, and he said, this is like appointing a tattoo artist to run healthcare for the country. Well, I don't think it's that bad, but people ought to be more concerned about what does this man really know? What does he bring to it? Now, if you're on the Hill, if you're in the Senate, and Rick Scott has made this very clear that whomever Trump, wants in those jobs, he's going to deliver. And I think you've got to keep in mind that, once again, the basic question is, where do you stand on war with Iran? What are you prepared to do? That's very important. That's the litmus test right now.
And according
all
to
of
that
these
litmus
people
test,
pass that test, Dan. I don't. You don't,
Yeah.
but they do.
And towards that to end on that litmus test, how about Mike Waltz? Where does he come down on that?
Well, I think he's very strongly in support of it. He was the guy that just a few weeks ago was arguing we need to give more strike weapons to Ukraine so that they can do more harm to the Russians. I mean, he's done an about face on that, much like Hegseth has, because Trump has, and has moved in a different direction. But these are people that are all ambitious, and that's a good thing, but they're also well aware of which way the wind is blowing. Remember, the problem on the Hill is preeminently concerned about keeping the money flowing. That's the other issue. Are you going to keep the money flowing behind closed doors? You're not going to change anything, are you? Don't slow it down. We got to keep it going. And that's what everybody has done now for decades. Oh, we'll keep it going. Don't worry about it, Senator. We'll keep it going. My shipyards have to operate. They have to produce. I got it. I understand that. That's where we are. Okay. And I think these people are all signed on for that. Radcliffe as well. But none of these people are people that you would compare with, say, someone like Paul Nitze, who was Secretary of the Navy, who was a very thoughtful man. And he struggled, in the Navy with ship design like everybody else, because he got tired of seeing the same ships turned out from shipyards that were clearly obsolete when there should have been new ships with, based on new designs.
Yeah.
He was moderately successful, not much, but at least he was a thoughtful man. He understood the strategic calculus. He was part of a generation of people, Republicans and Democrats, who all understood what the word war means. These people don't. They think war is Afghanistan. This is what I call bullet launchers against bullet launchers. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
The kind of war you want to avoid is one where the enemy shoots his AKs and you shoot your M16s. That's called symmetric warfare. We don't want it. We don't want to be involved with it. And somebody with an AK in a distant, remote place of no value to us, no education, and 16 brothers and sisters is just a drop in the bucket and can be killed and replaced instantly. But the people we commit are educated, trained, and they come from families that love them and know them. And they're only family, 2 or 3, perhaps in that family at most. The Israelis are in the same boat. Is that where we want to waste our human capital on these kinds of stupid things? And Tulsi Gabbard has said, no, we don't. She stands for that. I say, no, we don't. That's absolutely clear. All of a sudden, we're back to the same old thing. Well, Ukraine hasn't gone so well. Forget Ukraine. It's going to go away. It's like Vietnam. It went away. Now, what are we going to do? Oh, well, we got a new war to fight. That's in the Middle East. We got to join Israel and wipe out Iran. Nobody asks the question is, what does wipe out Iran mean? And if it means Iran's total destruction, how does that help us? And who does that bring into the equation for discussion? Nobody cares. It's not important. The average American listens and says, oh, yeah. Oh, those Iranians, they're bad guys. He's listened to that from Fox News, NBC, CNN forever. Doesn't know anything about Iran. And all of a sudden, oh, yeah, well, we'll bomb Iran. No biggie. Let me get back to work.
Yeah.
That's a bad assumption.
Yeah, this is like as though there's Syria. I think it was like Obama, Trump, and Biden all at one point or another launched some strikes into Syria, and there was, of course, Syria can't do anything about it. And I think that they think the same thing for Iran, but obviously that's going to be a significant difference.
For what it's worth, I wrote a paper and I was encouraged to write this paper. It's long, which is always bad because no one in the United States likes to read anything that's more than a few hundred words. This is long. It's 5,700 words. And it looks, what do we need? We need a new strategy. What's that strategy look like? Then what are we going to do about the armed forces? How do we design them? You know, what's driving change? And finally, what are we going to do about the overhead? You know, what's the overhead? And it goes through it pretty systematically. And it's posted by on a website, an anti-war website that supported RFK Jr. It's going to be posted sometime today by Dan McAdams on Ron Paul's website at the Ron Paul Institute. I encourage people to look at it because it was written to be a blueprint that could be a start point for fundamental change, for diverging from the failed policies of the last 3+ decades and move us in a new, more productive direction. It'll be castigated and hated by the neocons and their supporters who want us to go to war with Iran. And it doesn't say don't go to war with Iran or go to war with anybody. On the contrary, it says we need a new strategy. This is the framework, and we need new forces to implement it because the forces we have really are based on something that emerged from the Second World War that's almost 100 years ago. So I encourage people to look at that. I think the easiest access is probably to the Ron Paul Institute's website. People ought to look at it. You don't have to agree with all of it, but consider it as an alternative to where we're headed. And I think we're headed in a very dangerous direction. We haven't even talked, you and I, about the financial system.
Right.
You know, our banking system, according to all of the experts, whether it's James Ricards or Peter Druckenmiller or Gundlach or Nassim Taleb, is 8 times worse today in terms of fragility than it was in 2008. Hello, are we crazy? This isn't going to survive this kind of war, particularly if we go back to where you started. And suddenly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which have historically aligned with us, have marched out of our camp and said, no, we don't support this, and decide to pull all of their wealth out.
Yeah.
What do we do at that point? What's the impact on us? Well, I think we know.
And of course, you know, you say you hope people read this paper here. Of course, I wish I could get it in front of Donald Trump, because that would like be a blueprint for everything he says he stands for. This is how you execute it, which is why I was unshy about tweeting out and several other things that I thought you should have been the Secretary of Defense, because you understand how it needs to happen. I wish Tulsi Gabbard, recommended that she also be elevated as Secretary of State, because I think that would have, the two most powerful people, I think, in those two positions would have really helped Trump operationalize his vision, and all of America would have benefited from it. And I fear that some of the people he's tied himself to may go in the opposite direction.
Well, Dan, consider this. The President of the United States is unique in the world because he is simultaneously both the head of state, which is normally where you see a king or an emperor, and at the same time, he's the political leader of the country, and especially his party. So he's two things at once. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of people invested very heavily in him for the purpose of getting him elected so that he would back the war against Iran. That needs to be understood. Now, it's very, very difficult under the circumstances for him to ignore that, even though it's obviously in the interest of the American people, in my judgment, to stay away from that option. But he has to take their views into consideration. Anybody who thinks that money in politics really doesn't buy you anything is wrong. Money buys a lot. And cold, hard cash in great quantities has a reason or a reasoning of its own. And you can't survive in politics without it, or at least that's the view. And that's where we are. And it's not just President Trump, it's the entire government. The entire government falls into that particular category.
And just, I guess, lastly here, what could Trump, if Trump was watching our show here, or if he asked you your advice on this, what could he do to navigate that, try to thread that needle you're talking about there, but with these people he has in place to still get them to do his vision of the world and keep us out of wars?
Well, I'm not sure that's his vision. It's a good question. What is his real vision? You also, in addition to listening to what people say. You've also got to look at what they do. When you look at the cabinet, that's what he's doing. And if you don't think that matches things that he said in the past, well, then which side do you come down on? You have to come down on the side of what does he do? So I think it's pretty clear. Now, every president, let there be no mistake about this, has the right to select whomever the hell he wants. Now, the Senate doesn't necessarily have to comply. And clearly, during his last administration, he had no support from anybody on the Hill. Mitch McConnell ran a very powerful campaign of prevarication and outright disobedience and opposition. And he had the support of Schumer and his friends in the Democratic Party. This time it's a little different. The Republicans are going to control the Senate. They're going to have a new leader. It's probably Rick Scott, I suspect. Rick Scott is a loyal soldier. He's going to give Trump what he wants. But at the same time, remember that the Senate doesn't have to do that. They could resist. They could say thanks, but no thanks. But historically, Senate has turned out to be a rubber stamp Roman Senate. And the president is effectively being like the emperor. Unless, of course, it represents a disruption in the money flow. If you're going to stop the money, that's bad news. And so anybody who talks about cutting anything in terms of spending, that's like, walking into a party as Dracula and everybody who is there is holding the blood bank in their hands. You're Dracula, you have all the blood. You're not going to give Dracula any blood. So, I'm afraid things are going to have to progress to the point where there is no longer any choice but to cut. And we're not as far from that as many people think. And again, I cite the people, Ricards and the others. And remember, debt has always brought down empires. And we are an empire at this point, like it or not.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that we don't make a lot of these choices because it makes the strategic and tactical sense to do, but because we're financially constrained at some point. And man, part of me wishes that pressure could come earlier to prevent some of the worst outcomes that some people seem to want to do, because there is no reason for us to go to war anywhere in the Russia-Ukraine situation, in the Middle East, or in Asia. None of our interests would be served by there, and it would be nothing but a net loss, probably in every category. And we can only hope that sanity will prevail once whoever ends up getting these positions is confirmed.
Yeah. By the way, before I leave, there are two things I wanted to tell your audience. There are two wonderful podcasts, one with Scott Ritter and the other with Brian Berletic. And the one with Scott Ritter addresses this issue of advice and support and presidential action. And it's worth listening to him because his essential argument is correct, that at the end of the day, presidents can be given all sorts of advice, but that doesn't mean they have to take any of it. And they frequently don't. And Brian Berletic gave a great synopsis of the situation in Ukraine, which points to this unending steamroller across eastern Ukraine. And it's headed to the Dnieper River, as we've discussed before.
Yeah,
that's where it is. And I think anybody on the Russian general staff would argue we should at least reach that river, and we should reach it long before President Trump comes to office. And then we can decide what we want to do at that point, because that's a fait accompli. It's over, done.
Yep. And there's certainly a lot of actions on the ground. I saw some reports actually popped on my screen after we even came on that said there's increasing evidence of a large troop gathering in the southern part of the Eastern Front now, in the Zaporizhia area, which could indicate the preparation of the last final stages for a large Russian push in the south. And that could certainly unhinge a lot of the rest of that front if it ends up happening. So the early stages of that could be in play right now. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
I think they're definitely going to move to Dnipro. And I'm so grateful that someone changed the name of that city. It used to be Dnipropetrovsk, which took months and years of practice to say. So Dnipro's a lot easier. I'm grateful for that. But
it is.
I think that's coming.
Yeah, well, we're
right.
going to find out. we're certainly going to find out, and that could have a significant impact on what the Trump administration does, especially if you're right and that starts to fall apart before he even gets in. We'll have to wait and see how that happens. We just have to
remember at Potsdam, when there was a discussion of these things, and even before Potsdam, Stalin said repeatedly when the issue came up of what are you going to do, where are you going to stop, and so forth, he said that these facts will be decided on the ground by the forces that advance. And wherever we advance, we stay.
And that's exactly how it turned out. Well, listen, we'll continue to monitor all these things. And Doug, is always very, very grateful for your frank insights and all this, especially your historical contrast and understanding of how things have worked in the past and how it impacts the current and probably future of our country. So thanks very much.
Hey, thank you, Dan.
And as always, we are very grateful for you. Be sure and like and subscribe if you're new to our channel. I'll also recognize that we have a podcast version now. I know everybody can't always watch everything on the video, but you can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, and just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us there. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.